Hi, I'm Brian Cardiff, and welcome to Chicago Crystal.
I'm Jack, and this is Brian. Welcome to Chicago Crystal. Just to get it kicked off, Brian, I'm really interested. How did you get into programming and make your way to the Crystal community?
Oh, I started programming when I was really little, like 10-year-old. And there is a whole path that take me to being part of Crystal. And that's like a journey that go through high school, through university, through best friends, and finally to the project Crystal. It's like a whole road.
That's a pretty long road. I actually got a little bit of a insight into that with Ari. But in general, when you were 10 and learning to program, what kind of computer were you using? Is that around the Amiga days, or is that a little later?
It was a bit later. I was programming with a logo, with a little turtle, sometimes with 4 turtles at the time, but it was kind of fun. But it was already in the 486 machines. Although a year later, then I went back to XT80s and 386 with some electronics and robotics early days activities.
Early robotics. What type of early robotics did you do? Anything?
I did like a couple of years of a robotic course focused on Lego stuff before Mindstrom. It was after Technic. You have Dacta, which is the educational brand of Lego. I actually have my serial port Lego console still working. But yeah, so I start with electronics, transistors, some protoboards. It was pretty fun. It was like around 11 or 12-year-old, and then I jumped to a high school focus with in electronics.
I remember, I believe it was Mindstorm that had that UI where you can drag and drop sensors and they would send signals to motors and all that stuff. I built a few, kind of mech-like arms and feet robots. They didn't really do much, but they could follow a black line on a white background.
No, I was like, before that, it was before Mindstrom. Mindstrom didn't exist at that time when I was like doing robotic in Lego. So it's been ages.
Yeah, and that got you kind of kickstarted. How did you make it into, when you were in college, did you do computer science? And how did you make it to kind of the collegiate computer science level?
Right after high school, I went straight to computer science here in Buenos Aires. It's called, in the Exactas, it's called the university, in the UBA. And I enjoy a lot the specifications, the theoretical about programming, and then on the programming language itself, I enjoy that a lot. It was straightforward. It was like when I met that career, I was like, yes, this is the thing I want to do. This is the approach I want to do when programming, because I was already programming as a part-time job during high school, so it fits really good. And from there, I started working at Manas, which is where I still work today after mostly 15 years. And I met a lot of people. I met Ari, was a colleague in the university. We started a career together. So there is a history there.
So how did you meet Ari?
We were the top 2 grades on the first exam in the programming course, and I wanted to meet him. So that's how I actually met him. It's like there was this other person. I wasn't sure if it was a boy or a girl because the name. It was the first time I heard that name. So who is Ari? And then we start being friends, and we start working together in projects during college. And eventually I asked him to join Manas back then, like many years ago.
So you joined Manas first and then brought Ari. What attracted you to Manas?
My best friend is the brother of one of the founders of Manas. So that's one of the relationships. It's like near the family.
Okay.
But also the two founders, Nico and Juan, went to my same high school. Although they're a couple of years older than me, not much, just a little bit. This high school allowed some students to work, to have like an internship inside the school in the IT department of the school, making systems for the school while being students. So there I actually met Juan and Nico, like when I was 15 years old.
Okay. Yeah, I've had a short call with both of them. They seem very nice. I can imagine that they would build a pretty good company. Mm-hmm. You at Mantis have a pretty interesting role. At least on the website, it says you're a principal engineer, a product manager, and a researcher. That's a lot of things to do at once. What do you do at Mantis now?
I still like, depending on the project that I'm running, I play more heavy one role or the other. I am principal engineer since I need to organize some project and make decisions of the design, even if I am not coding, like and have like a more bigger picture of the technologies that are need to be used and how they interact. Team lead is, well, basically because I have some people that I need to organize their work and their schedule for meeting the deliverables of the different projects we have been working across the year. And research, I like that title a lot. The thing is that not everybody in the industry has a more academic background. And I love the academic background that the college put on me. Like, I like the research, not only learning new technologies, but also revisiting what is being done on the academic and see if there can happen some transfer. It's not an active role as much as I would like to, because you need to have the opportunity to make that transfer, right? Of ideas, of technology, of experience. And I don't know, for example, I have experience with SAT solvers that made me more confident of emitting some judgment regarding some of the works, regarding shards, for example, if the resolver was a SAT solver or not. But then on other projects, for example, I'm very fond of a Prolog of the language. So on certain projects, some of the ideas come from those backgrounds and not only coding and using dependencies and solving in the more traditional way. I just like to take a step back and see if there is another theory or backgrounds that we can use to solve some problems. And that have happened a couple of times. I have used Prolog at Manas twice or three times.
What did you use Prolog for? I haven't thought of that since college.
There were two nice examples where one, we designed like a card deck, like a physical card deck to help farming. It was like a farming kit. It tells you how you can put plants together or in a sequential timeline order to make appropriate usage of the soil, something about that. So you needed to design the card, and it's like a huge space to search the solution. Like, you need to express some constraints and come up with the solution. And actually, that Prolog can do pretty well, because you can express different constraints and find a solution, even if that takes a bit long. So it was more important the solution than the code, because you only need to run it once, actually. So it's a different challenge. And then a more recent project was regarding the fashion industry. It was a way to make somehow like an expert system where you can express rules for matching clothes, or clothes and colors and textures. So someone very that has that knowledge can express those rules, and a system can start matching outfits. So we did some proof of concept or MVPs regarding that, and non-technical people were able to use a DSL based on Prolog to express fashion rules. It was cool.
That sounds pretty cool. I just realized we've been chatting for a bit, and just for people following along, Mantis is where Crystal was conceived or started, but what is Mantis, the company that you're working for?
Mantis is a software company. It's a group of people that loves to work together, and we don't have a specific goal as the kind of product that we want to work on. We like to do stuff that we find interesting and challenging and with impact, and they're not maybe conventional. We went through, we did a lot of work for the humanitarian and healthcare systems through a partnership with Instead, which is a client of us. But also we designed the software that is run on a helmet of an astronaut a couple of years ago. And then we did programming languages. And so there is a variety. We have systems that use IVRs or SMS and integrate that to gather information more quickly to make faster decisions. So we did a lot of things.
Yeah. I hope they let you do product testing in space for the astronaut helmet.
Yeah, they did. They worked in the desert last year. That story is on the website. It was a really nice project.
I will have to go back and read that. And then in Mantis, mm-hmm. you started, or Crystal was started. When did you first hear about Crystal, and when did you first get involved?
Well, we've heard about Crystal. There was an idea that Ari and Juan started playing around. Mainly Ari, he started learning about LLVM and what can be done. And we at Manage, we have been using Ruby for a lot of years, and we just start talking about a side project, something fun to do. I was in the programming language course at university, being a teaching assistant there. So I was pretty fond of let's design a language. What do we want there? And so we start talking about between the three of us what can be done, small things, small experiments. That was around 2012. September 2012 was the first commit of Crystal. Although it was named different back then, it was called Joy or something like that, I think.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I was looking through the repo and saw the name Joy and was confused, but the repo had been renamed, but the original commit still had files and references to Joy. Do you remember when you first jumped on the Crystal project, kind of at least in the GitHub history, what the first things that you addressed were? What the first projects you had?
I didn't search for that. I remember back then my first contribution were not in code. It was more in the whiteboard, designing whether we should have implicit unions or not, and how to design the type inference to handle recursive functions. I think that those were my main two inputs in the language, and those were in the whiteboard and not in the commit history. Yes. Because back then I remember that Juan and Ari were able to stay after work because they were really motivated, and I wasn't with that availability of time. Once the Crystal moved to an official managed project and not only a side project of them, I was able to start coding in my work hours more efficiently. But I don't remember what was the first contribution actually.
I have actually been looking into some of your work on unions, so let's just jump straight to that. You've posted some of your whiteboarding on Twitter, and you have talked about unions in CodeGen before. I am really interested where the idea of unions came from. They're normally what I associate as a lower level concept from C or C++, but where did the original idea of putting unions in Crystal come from?
Definitely not from C. I think they come from the background of doing some formal definition of the type system of a language. And when you start designing these rules, either if a term, judgment of types, I know my English is not well here in this term because I did the course in Spanish, but you have judgments of whether some expressions can be typed as some specific type given a context. And you can play around and start adding features to the language to make them more rich and more comfortable to the user. I think the idea was from there, like, I don't want to change this expression in order to type. So what I need to add to the type system, and for me, the answer was unions, because you want this expression to be able to represent either that value or whatever union containing that value. So there is an expansion there. That kind of criteria appears a lot when you start playing around with the formality of the language, even languages that doesn't exist. And that is simple because they are smaller languages, so you can play a lot there.
Okay. Yeah. And on the scale of like formal to informal, Crystal kind of, I don't know, it's not extreme one way or the other. It seems like it has a very concrete kind of type system, but it does a lot of inference, which like makes it feel so easy to work in. What were kind of the choices you guys had to make with the type system and with unions, and how hard were those choices?
There is a mixture, because each of the three of us, Juan, Ari, and me, have different backgrounds and different tastes, right? And at the beginning, it's easier to find a sweet spot because there is room for improvement for everybody. So that's sometimes we have a more pragmatic approach on the time system or the implementation, and maybe some of the ideas that are more formal need to be pushed from another direction. So that's why we have some sort of mixture of how formality or informality crystal is, because that's in the very nature. We have like this different pragmatic or formal approach, and we kind of reach a middle ground. So regarding the decision and what we need to make, for example, I remember at the beginning when we start introducing the union types, and we also have the nil, which was a special specimen in the type system, because it has this special meaning, what is nil and what is not, and we wanted to separate nil from all the other types. So that forced us to have unions right from the beginning, like nillable ints or nillable strings. And then we started implementing exceptions, and we needed a different type for meaning functions that will never return. Those are the no return types, which doesn't appear that much, but they are there. And there are some rules regarding how unions plays with nils or with no returns that are not trivial at the very first glance. You need to iterate on those ideas. One, for example, is that a union between an int and a no returns leads an int, and not the union disappeared there. It's like a neutral element. It just go away. It's like multiplying for one. It just doesn't matter. You're doing a union with no return. It's hard without a whiteboard to explain this, but that's how it works.
I think I kind of understand some of it. So I have a question for you. Mm-hmm. Currently, I am doing a project where I'm overloading 2s, and I do it pretty consistently. And 2s's usually return nil. Now, why does a 2s return a nil instead of a no return?
2s's return nil
instead of no return.
Two incompatible as you're doing two casts one after the other.
Well, I'm just kind of interested in the difference, like the distinction between a nil versus a no return. There are just some functions that it seems very logical to return a nil, like some type of inspection into like a hash or something like that, where you have a fetch question mark, where nils seem to indicate that you're not getting any value. So the nil is just kind of an uninitialized or empty value. But for something like 2s, you're just never expecting anything to be returned. Would 2s fit more into like a no return type or like a type, or would it be more of a nil type?
No, it will be more like a nil type, because no returns, it doesn't mean that there is no return value. It means that the function never returns. So it's like erasing or exit, like the program will will stop there, or at least that fiber, that routine will stop there. It's not that there is no result. There is never a return even. So
Okay.
it's more more drastic, and that's why, for example, the union between if you may return an int or may raise, the answer of that computation is an int, because the raising can always happen. There is always an implicit exception that could happen on any operation of the language, because we have exceptions and raise and rescues as other languages, right? The exceptions are not a value as in Go, for example, that they are returned explicitly, right?
That makes sense. I think I just misunderstood it. Hopefully someone who is listening to this will have learned something from that explanation. Another thing that I saw that you did a fair amount of work in, and also a few blog posts on, is CodeGen. What is CodeGen, and where do the boundaries in CodeGen between Crystal and LLVM kind of lie?
Well, there will be no Crystal without LLVM right now. Neither since the beginning. Starting a new language was way easier, because we were able to use LLVM, or doing a language that was compiled to native code. Like without LLVM, we will have needed to solve a lot of problems that we didn't want to. It was not the fun part of doing a language, right? So CodeGen is the part that it takes the information of what is being expressed in the source code, for example, at some stage, and translate it to emitting the LLVM IR, which is the language that you use to program in LLVM. Nobody will write LLVM IR by hand, probably, like a huge program, because it's like near to assembler. So the CodeGen is how to generate those files from whatever information you have. In Crystal, that is more or less the AST, or the representation of the program in memory, plus some other analysis or conclusions that the compiler does before jumping to the CodeGen phase.
Totally makes sense. So just to be clear, Crystal actually has an output that actually outputs IR, and LLVM reads that and then generates a binary from that. And there are some tools in Crystal to even look at the IR. Is that correct?
Yes, totally correct. You can see the IR, you can see the assembly output directly, the .s file. You can check what are the optimizations done on behalf of LLVMs to see if the methods are inline or not, and debug weird stuff when they doesn't work.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting the way that all that works. I have actually looked into LLVM a little bit, and they say that they have some APIs for supporting classes and class-like concepts. Does Crystal use any of that, or is a lot of the kind of IR, or is a lot of the Crystal that's generated, is it mostly done kind of boutique or from scratch?
We use you can mimic LLVM to a plain C program that you declare structs and just functions, and you pass those structures as arguments, and you use them as objects, for example.
Okay.
The LLVM that we generate is mostly that we declare structs depending from the declarations to store the instance variables, and then we have a bunch of functions with some mangling in the name. So that would be the IR subset that we use. There are with every version of LLVM, they introduce new concepts. For example, I know there was some recent development for coroutines or for yielding methods. Those kind of things, we are not using them. Those are like manually code-gen using more simple constructs. Maybe because we did just with the things that were available at the time and we didn't migrate. And also because that will push us, which is the LLVM needed to compile the compiler, right? So it's like depends.
Yeah, that discussion.
Features.
Yeah, that discussion happened a few times in the GitHub issues, and one of the discussions about changing our restrictions for which LLVM could be used was for the debugger. I saw on dev.to that you wrote a blog post about debugging Crystal and using VS Code and things like that. What do you think about the adding the debugger and the kind of pressure that puts on the LLVM or the feature set of the LLVM?
It's definitely a great feature to be able to debug the language. There are more tools that I would like to add to meet the state of the art of other languages. Definitely. So the debugger, great. I'm totally for that. I would also like to have coverage tools, different code analysis. I'm really fond of those. But regarding pushing the LLVM version, the struggle is that eventually, if we want to ship a compiler that can use native packages on different platforms, and that package to be small, we need to have a lower bound of the requirements matching that target. So the binary can be smaller because we can link against the built-in LLVM or the default LLVM of different distributions. So I don't want to lift that restriction that much, although I think we have come to a long end supporting 391 probably. So there can be some cleanup, definitely.
Yeah. 391 seems so old at this point, but I totally understand what you're saying. Some of the tools and analysis that LLVM provides is pretty cool. Yeah, I've tried to add a few of those and ran into problems. I'm not as up to speed on LLVM.
Yeah, and it's hard to keep up to date with even their development. They are moving far more faster in these last couple of years than before. Like the migration from 3.9 to 4 lasts a lot, and now suddenly we are at 10. Like what happened in the middle? And and I was pretty excited for example, from some link time optimizations. I did some spikes there, and that worked fine on 4. And then we need to improve our testing to be sure that new additions like the debugger or the link type optimizations are not broken when upgrading from LLVM versions. And that's not the case. Well, the debugger, there are some initial tests there to ensure that won't happen. But the LTO is, we need to revisit that.
Is LTO even still a flag? I remember reading blog posts years ago about LTO and using LTO as a compiler flag. Does that still exist?
Yes, that still exists, but the last time I used it was when I tried to, like when I watched some videos of some conferences, say, yes, I want that for Crystal. Maybe it helps. And it was actually not really needed. It was for huge programs that it's not the case right now. It helps in the longer run, but in nowadays it's not that needed, and so it's polluted there, and it's probably broken since LLVM 6 or 7. Yeah.
So another optimization that you wrote about, this is a little bit different, we're just going to jump tracks a little bit, is the Docker optimization and doing the dependencies, like mapping out your dependencies and just having those in the Docker image. I thought that was a really cool blog post that you wrote and definitely went down a little bit of a rabbit hole. However, I found it really hard to maintain in projects. But in general, how did you get into Docker, and what started that idea of doing kind of the Crystal Docker optimization?
Well, there was many compile languages that wanted to do that. There is also the balance, like if you use Docker for development environment versus the Docker for shipping the project. And sometimes the easy way is to just use the Docker with the compiler, right? In case of interpreted language, that is fine. If you are running a Rails application, you need Ruby in the Docker. But for compile application, you don't need that. And that motivates the story about multi-stage Docker images a lot. That applies to Java because you only need the runtime, not the compiler. On Rust and Go, all those compiled languages don't need a compiler on the final image. And so there was a lot of stories like how to build this multi-stage. And when Docker finally announced a beta, an experimental feature for this, we just jumped to the party. It's like, yes, I wanted that the language is doing, but I wanted to Crystal, and it's totally doable because a lot of the stories for compiled languages are shared, are common. You have the library, you have the source, you have the compiler, whatever language it is, the stories are the same. But you need documentation on your languages to know what to use, because you don't want to learn about linkers and a lot of stuff if you are just focused on programming in this specific language. So there needs to be some translation of the techniques from different compiled languages to another. And that's what this post is about. I think when I wrote that post, I linked to the post that gave me the ideas of writing this. Like, hey, this is available in Docker, and it's being used in, I don't know, Rust or Go or whatever, and say, hey, this is the post for Crystal. This is how you do it. And
it's pretty awesome.
Yeah,
I've actually used this.
And from here, I just remember that all this, you need to adapt to that language. Maybe how to gather the libraries, the dependencies. And actually, this post helped me help myself when I needed to code the Snapcraft plugin, which does the same technique. It grabs the dependencies and bundle it together. So it helped to have that already coded somewhere.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, I saw you went to Snapcraft Summit, I think the 2018 or 2019 Summit. I mostly associate Snapcraft with more kind of kernel developer focused initiatives. How did you get involved with Snapcraft, and how did you get involved in the summit?
I received an invitation, and it was wonderful. I just find an email and say, hey, Brian, do you want to come to the Snapcraft in Montreal? And say, yes, I love Montreal. The dates were great. So how I did get involved, it was an open invitation for directly to me or Manas/me to go there because of my work on Crystal. My first reaction was say, hey, you know that I live in Argentina? That's like a long trip. It's an expensive trip. Are you sure the invitation still holds? And when I get the answer that, yes, we know you're from Argentina, we want you to come from Montreal, I say, yes, then, yes, I'm all in.
That's very nice of them.
Yeah, it was really nice. Some of the Snapcraft people are Argentinian also, so maybe that helps to know what is the situation. Luckily, I already had a visa for Canada because I needed one. And I spent a wonderful week there. They allowed me to stay a couple of days more, and I took the advantage to visiting some friends there. And it was great. And the summit actually is not only about kernel stuff. They have two tracks, more in IoT and more in the desktop environment. So there are two different tracks at once, and there's a lot of helping within each other's. There were people from Julia and people from other persons, but I talk a lot with the Julia people from Nix, and it was great for us to help each other with the different challenges because maybe Snapcraft was new for us in different levels, and it was great to start sharing stories on how to solve the same problems in different languages or projects.
I've heard Julia give a few talks on LLVM and stuff. I'm pretty sure there's some more stories you guys could share. I gave a talk on Crystal, kind of the case for Crystal, trying to convince people Crystal's a language that they can use. And in that talk, people compare Crystal or ask how Crystal compares to Julia frequently. I don't understand how. I mean, I kind of do, but I'm surprised that people associate Julia and Crystal. What do you think, is similar and different between Julia and Crystal?
I haven't coded a lot on Julia. The most similar thing that I think we have is the multi-dispatch. That is not as common in many type languages, actually.
Well, it's hard. It's a very hard thing to implement.
Yeah, it's hard to implement, or it's hard to convince that it's a good decision. Like it depends on how you want to programming, what expressivity you want to have, because if you have static types mentioned all over the place, having the usual dispatch is easier and is understandable. But I think that when you have type inference and you don't have a lot of types mentioned, it needs to be a multi-dispatch. So use the type in runtime to choose which overload you should run. Yeah, there is that.
Now, for those that are following us but they don't know what multi-dispatch is, how would you describe multi-dispatch?
Is when you have a call to a method, you need to know you can have multiple overloads, multiple definition of the same method name for different type of arguments. In some languages, in languages with multi-dispatch, you will need the runtime information of the argument to choose which is the overload to use. On the other hand, on static languages, with like in C#, for example, you will know from the expression in the call site, in the call, which is the type of the argument. Maybe it's a super class, a base class of a design, and that is the only information available to choose which is the overload. It doesn't matter if you are using a subclass. You just on that, for the compiler, that expression is of the base type, and it will call some implementation with the base type as the argument. For implementing a visitor pattern, is really great to have multi-dispatch. It's far more better.
Yeah,
that's a nice exercise.
Yeah, multi-dispatch is amazing. I think it took me a while to understand that multi-dispatch was happening. It's so easy in Crystal to do certain things that you just kind of forget it's there, but it's a very nice feature. And Ari had a great talk, which if people are listening, they can go see on YouTube or the Chicago Crystals YouTube channel. You mentioned C#, and I have found that looking through kind of your blog posts and what you've put on GitHub, you seem to be a language connoisseur. But one feature of C# I think is really cool and underrated is link. And you actually did a blog post on that. Do you think there's anything that we can, in the Crystal community, learn from link and possibly bring into Crystal? We should probably explain what link is too.
Yes. In .NET 4, or BT4, no, it was 4, I think. They introduced this idea that the compiler can understand the expressions that are there. It's an old story, but in this end up allowing tools like doing embedded SQL statement, for example, or SQL-ish statement that are type safe in C#. So that being able to have that feature was great on .NET. But that also helped, for example, when implementing mocking libraries, and you say, hey, if this object will receive a call for this method, return this or that, with Rhino or other mocking frameworks using .NET at that time, there is no guarantees that what you are mocking is type safe or is respect the API of the base classes. When LinkU appeared, that was able to improve. You were able to do type safety queries, type safety mocks. It was a great story, and it's just a feature that allows you to go far beyond, because you are able to modify, to understand the expression and do stuff with that. It's really powerful. Yeah. So I think that we could use something like that in the future, but we have metaprogramming, and that kind of solves a lot of other issues also. But I'm pretty fond of LinkU. It's a great tool to embed languages, which is something I really like. I try to embed languages before in Crystal, and there's always some tension there, and maybe something like Link will help.
Yeah, it'd be a pretty interesting addition. I thought it was a relatively underrated feature of C#, but one that I don't really have too many excuses to use, mostly because I don't program in C# that often. But I noticed as well that you have done some Cocoa work and Objective-C work, and Cocoa work inside Crystal. I didn't even realize Cocoa at one point was in Crystal. Um, what was Cocoa doing in Crystal, and why did it leave?
Why did it leave? Well, at the beginning, like you want to be able to reach broader audiences, you need to reach really near their shores, right? You say, hey, you can do this for UI, you can do this for web servers, you can do this for CI. So you need to show that that's a possibility, right? Everything is code, so eventually you can do a lot of stuff with most of the languages, but you need to have a easy ramp up to do those kind of stuff. I have done some couple of native OS X and iPhone applications, not a lot, but a couple. So, and I would love to see a Crystal applications on an iPhone someday. That means ARM, that means Cocoa, and a lot of other stuff. But so it was an experiment of how to embed that, like Swift or Objective-C, it's compiled through LLVM. We are on the same boat. How can we jump as near as they are to build desktop applications? So that's why Cocoa started, or Crocoa, because it was like the art of Crystal there. And it's not that it left Crystal, but at the beginning we were a bit more messy, and we just put everything in the main repo, and then we started putting it away. There was some TCL also bindings, because we want to say, hey, how are we integrating good with binding for TCL, Cocoa, GTK, whatever library, UI library, because UIs are really important. It's not everything is a CLI or a web server.
That totally makes sense. That's a very, very good way to think about it. There are so many things that you just mentioned. We're gonna have to skip over some of them. I would love to know about the ARM progress, but I'm thinking that could be a long conversation. I think Ruby has a TCL library still in the main repo, but it's harder to use. But in general, all of this revolves around kind of evangelizing the language. Where do you think we need to go with, or where do you think you would like to go with Crystal kind of evangelizing, and what platforms would you like to see Crystal on? What do we need to get there?
Oh, that's a hard question. Because I think that there are some lost battles all around that make us less clear which is the winning path. For example, I don't think there is a clear winning for doing UI on Ruby, although Ruby can be run on Windows and on Linux, right? You have the shoe library, but the rewrite, I don't know if it was ever published. On Windows, you have clear preference for native applications, because otherwise there's not as fluid as the user will expect. So I think the first thing is that it would be great to have a graphic library with controls that will work across the board, but that is like really hard to get. So I'm not sure what is the clear winning. Whatever library it can be used on different compiled languages, we should be able to use it, and it will be great to take that. I know libUI, I think it's in early stages probably. I haven't tested, but the idea is great. It's like a C library that renders native on each platform. Great, just go and do it. But it's hard. And on top of that, nowadays with all the web developments and additions of the HTML5 and grid, there are a lot of ideas of how to do layouts that they are just too new to jump and settle for one of them. But there is a lot of movements there. The only thing I like so far in the last couple of years was actually Objective-C with the Xcode builder, the UI, the constraints. It allows you to decouple the code and the UI a lot. My previous experience was with Visual Studio, actually, like doing the layouts there. But they are not portable as I would like to. So I don't have a clear path for what should be done, but I would like.
Yeah, I think portability has been the kind of sticky point of the industry. There's definitely projects like Qt or other things like that try to make it so you can deploy on multiple platforms. But the browser is the probably most universally portable thing right now. And I think Grid is great. You mentioned Grid, and I had a lot of fun playing with Grid. I think it's how do I put it? I think that Flexbox ate Grid's lunch. Like I feel like most people learn Flexbox and stop there, and Grid has a lot of things that are pretty cool, but just people that learn Flexbox, I think, were questioning why they would also need to learn Grid.
Yes, but and after you join, Flex and Grid are things that are nowadays popular on HTML, right? And maybe if you go back to Java, GWT, and other UR libraries, you don't have those concepts. But those concepts are really improvement from the state of the art of a couple of years ago. But I don't know, maybe we need an agnostic, an HTML free version of Grid and Flexbox to do layouts and controls and those kind of. But that is too integrated with the native libraries of the UI. It will be hard to have a Windows controls with the grid semantics and how they resize. They all need to be designed together, I think, to play nice.
These are complicated problems. I do not envy the UI framework developers. I think that there's a lot of considerations in there. And then if you are interested in the security community, then there's a ton of other considerations based on opacity levels and what's on top of other things, and how to actually design UI frameworks in ways that they can't be abused. So the depth of like that specific space is quite deep, and you have to. It feels like you have to be in the space for a while before you understand why a certain thing is the way it is.
Yes, otherwise you just are doing proof of concepts, which are great, but then that's not enough. Like having a window with a button and say "Hello World" is not enough for calling a UI framework because all the reasons that you mentioned. My focus when I was doing Krakoa was about the life cycle of the objects, how to integrate, how are the different idioms, either is a value type or a reference type, how can those be matched, how to generate the methods. It was more on a integration with the library thing or experiment. Like we now have named arguments that could be matched to have keyword arguments in Objective-C. So there are a lot of stories interesting from the language perspective, and I was focused more on those to see if it's doable. But the UI, the portable UI library, it's still an open question.
Yeah, I really like libui. I don't remember when it was. It was probably a few years ago. I tried to download it and build some simple things on my computer, and getting the library installed was a pain. They did not have it in Brew, and the Brew issue said it's too unstable. And I got one working, but the reproducibility was way too low. I didn't feel like putting more energy into a project in which getting libui to work on the computer was at least at that barrier. So I really hope that project moves forward. I should really check in on it again and see if it's come further. There's been a few Qt projects in Crystal that I hope get developed. It seems like you do a lot of UI based projects. What are some projects that you've written in Crystal?
Project that I have written in Crystal. Well, one part of the compiler was the playground. I think that was one of the biggest contributions that I made in the early days. Like the playground that you can branch by Crystal Play. That's like, again, a UI HTML. Well, that's portable, let's say, so supposedly. So that could be seen as a separate project. Then recently, I made some integration between Localize and GitHub for Flatten the Curve site, because we need to coordinate some translations that were coming really fast and we need to preview them. So it was like a small service to integrate that was done on Crystal. It was really tiny. And then I have done some APIs replacement from some Ruby project that we have to make more performant or less resource consuming versions of them. But then actually other person on Manas were able to code projects as a whole in Crystal. That that wasn't my role. I was helping them every now and then, but I'm more focused on the compiler and the standard library and some shards around that writing project right from scratch. Although I have some side projects there. I am trying to make a web server for a photo library. Digicam is a open source photo management library that I'm trying to start to use, but I want to have a web server for that for mobile eventually. I don't know. So that's being called in Crystal because it was needed. But then I don't know. We have done on Manage. We have done some simulators, like how do you say? Simulate some simulators to do experiments. We have some Slack bots, the Telegram bots, and some helpers for us for doing internal accounting and cash flow management. Those are small pieces of software run on Crystal. And I think I know we have some couple of more, but they slip my mind right now.
That's okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like the initial projects of a language kind of help provide some of the feature sets of that language, which end up being so far at Manus UI and web or web frameworks or web servers. Yeah, it's kind of interesting the way that Crystal is developed. It seems like you have a lot of ideas for where Crystal could go. I really would love to see Crystal in the machine learning space, not just because the machine learning space is popular, but because it seems like, I don't know, whenever I kind of dive into the machine learning stuff, it seems like a lot of things are, I guess, loose is the best way to put it.
Definitely. I totally agree. I want to see Crystal as a good alternative for machine learning, for doing some research, because for doing number crunching and doing all those kind of stuff, it should be really, really great to see it shine there. And I think what is more needed is to make those stories simple, because the technology is there, but you need to make them evident that they are there, how you can be used. We have done some proof of concept integration for Jupyter notebooks running Crystal, for example. That would be cool. There was a recent post about charting in Crystal that was it looks really awesome. I think that we need some shard to load pandas or whatever format numbers are stored, and then we can start from there.
A big barrier will also be integrating, I think, with CUDA or whatever people use for graphic or the GPU acceleration stuff. But I've heard some people say that those type of integrations are really complicated, but it already seems like Crystal's tackled some pretty big problems. So I'm not sure how complicated it is for the Crystal community.
I think it can be done. And for example, going back to the link question, some of the GPU usage, it requires you to encode the statements in a different way, right? I want to add these and these numbers for the whole array. And it's not that you want to emit the add instruction on the assembler, but you want to say to someone, perform the addition. And those kind of things can be done with link, for example, but it also can be done with macros. On some of the integration, for example, with Prolog, I did those kind of things. Like I have this expression, but if I am targeting Prolog, I need to, the ampersand means something different, or the sequential operator in Crystal means this sequential operator in Pro. So you can do some translation during macros. So there is room to start digging there, but it needs to be resolved from one step back. It's not just coding functions, but you need to have a broader view of the problem to have a more natural solution in the language.
Yeah. So we were talking about LINQ a little bit and macros, and I totally hear what you're saying. And I'm really I feel like our macro system in Crystal is very powerful, but whenever I program in it, it kind of pulls me out of Crystal. I feel that the syntax is not unpredictable, but it's just kind of not as much Crystal. It's a really kind of silly and subjective thing, but so much of Crystal has developer happiness, and I feel like the macro system is both very powerful, but sometimes a little hard to use or to read.
Yes, I agree with that. I think there's some tension because the macro is more like an imperative language, like a templating, like ERB or ECR. Like you are like in telling the compiler to type for you. That's the level of metaprogramming that we mostly do. Like just type this or that. That is like, it's not really abstract way of doing stuff. I will really love to have a way to metaprogram more with rules or with statements of desire of what I want instead of mimicking the typing. That will allow you to do more interesting stuff, but it's hard to find the right abstraction for that.
Do you think there's space for a third kind of abstraction, one being normal, regular Crystal code, the second being the macro system, and the third being something like LinkQ? Or do you think that that's too many things in one language?
Oh, I think that there is room for improvement. It can be done. Definitely there starts to be some history of the language itself, so it's not easy to change with a new idea that seems better than the one that we have, because we can do that every time when it's settled a little bit. But I think there is still room for improvements, because maybe we start designing the current macro. Initially didn't support, I think, yielding blocks, but now they do. And yielding blocks can serve as an expression, and you can parse it and do those kind of things. One small recent example, Juan recently changed some code, or it's still not merged, but there are some additions to declare formatters, for example, more easily for the new logger. And it's a really simple but powerful way of using macros, because he's understanding the string interpolation in a specific way. So, and it's great because you're using an aspect of the language, a construct of the language, and give it a different meaning, which is kind of makes sense for that use case. It's a clever use, and it's a nice thing that can be written in the current Crystal. Without seeing the PR, it's hard, but it's great to see that the improvements of the log formatter and how macros can be used there.
Yeah, I've seen some recent activity on the log formatters, both in the issues and in the PRs. It's kind of interesting to see where that's going. I think that there were some comments about someday even removing or having all the features of Dexter, which is part of the Lucky framework, be folded into Crystal, which would be awesome to remove that dependency from Lucky, but also just to have those features in Crystal.
Yes, and also we don't want to have so many ways of doing basic or usual stuff in the ecosystem at all. Like we don't want to have 3 different logging frameworks in the community. Like we want to have a strong one, so it's easier to jump from project to project. That is something that we have see in different communities, sometimes as good stories or something as bad stories. Like, for example, on Ruby, you have active record and another abstraction to the layer to access database. And on Crystal, we have Crystal DB, which is small. It's not the best one, but we want the ORMs to be there based on Crystal DB. For the logging framework, it will be great if you just need to know how to log on Crystal and not log with a log for Crystal, right? Or my log for Crystal. It will be too much burden on the context switch from project to project. That's why we want to have this kind of things really settled on the standard library, or at least in the Crystal Lang organization. Yeah.
I was going to say, Matt's at one point said if he could do something over, he mentioned a few things, but one was the HTTP library. And I feel like in Ruby, there are so many options for HTTP, and that has just been something that's kind of not plagued that community, but definitely been confusing for some people. And sometimes you'll have different third-party dependencies or vendors that will ship with different HTTP implementations. And it gets kind of frustrating to have both, I think it's Typhus and HTTP Party and whatever one someone else wants to include with their, kind of backend. Yeah. I think another thing that I'm kind of choking up here a little bit. So you had mentioned kind of like just what to include in the standard library and what to not include in the standard library. And I noticed that you guys had Cocoa in the beginning, but there's kind of an ongoing issue about what to include and what not to include, and whether to pull things out in shards or whether to include them. Why would you not want things in the standard library, and what are the benefits of having them in the standard library?
The pros of having in the standard library is that they are there directly. There is no dependencies to be added. There is less friction to choose because it's like the choice is already made, right? You don't need to think more of that. I think that's part of the joy. I want standard libraries with batteries included. One thing is being in a standard library, and the other thing is being on the prelude by default, right? So there is two different levels of being in the standard library today. I agree that things might need to be required to be used. I don't need to be them right available, but it's great to have them shipped with the compiler directly. It feels more. Let's say it requires a lot of effort to have a lot of different packages around with their version restrictions, and be sure that they can talk to each other well. It requires a lot of effort to reach that level of stability. Being on the standard library and shipping with the compiler is one way to ensure some level of integration and cohesiveness between them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think a comment that's been brought up consistently, at least in the GitHub issues, is that having things inside the Crystal standard library will decrease the speed of development, that they will be slower to respond to changes. I happen to find that the Crystal compiler is relatively easy to contribute to, so that hasn't been as big of a problem that I see, but that has been a problem that's been brought up quite frequently.
So when the thing is that you will not be able to release that version, that change on the standard library because as its own, because you will need to wait for a release cycle of the compiler, because compiler and standard library are shipped together. That's definitely the cons side of that. That did happen with CrystalDB. At the beginning, I hoped to be shipped in the standard library, but the decision was to make it a shard, and it was actually a good decision because it requires a couple of iterations, and we were able to do it faster by being an independent shard. And also because it's not necessarily that everybody needs the CrystalDB dependency. So if it's not that common, it's good to have it in an external shard.
That makes.
Yeah. But I don't know, regarding how easy it is to contribute, there have been some, or the slowdowns, there have been ideas about maybe you can use a new version of the standard library or a branch version of the standard library without building a new compiler. That is kind of doable but it requires some manual hacking. But the other thing that we are trying to push now is to flag some features of the standard library as experimental. And the idea behind that is that when they are added, they are subject to change without enforcing the semantic versioning contract or policy. So you can use it. That will allow us to iterate on feedback easier because even if they are in standard library, they are not like hard contracts in the semantic version meaning, right? So that could mystify the slowdown. So hey, doing a contribution to the standard library doesn't requires a huge commitment if we flag it as experimental, for example.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What things are you working on in Crystal right now? And are you working on anything that's experimental?
From the last couple of weeks or months already, the focus was to raise some certain of stability to reach 1.0. I've been focused on a lot of cleanups that were voted among the core team. Like we evaluate what was dirty or not as nice as we want in the top level. And so I did a lot of like polishing there. Not very interesting, but it was like the idea to have a more polished 1.0 standard library. I focused on the log metadata, recently, but on the whole logging module in the last couple of weeks, because it was one of the things that we were sure that we were not happy enough for 1.0 release. And then I'm working on some stuff regarding distributions to see if we can improve how distribution on the different architectures and distributions and distros are being done, hopefully to improve the state of the art of that. Those is mostly the things that I'm working on. And always the changelog.
I love the new logging module. It took me a little bit of time to get used to and just like use in general. I really like the design of it. Took, has a little bit of not a learning curve. You just got to like understand it a little bit. But the new syntax for logging with metadata, I know it's just a syntax thing, but it's it's not my preferred syntax to log with emit. I'm hopeful that there will be a shorter thing or something that just looks a little bit more like you're logging with metadata as opposed to calling functions. But I understand the complexity behind it.
Yeah, the idea was not to jump into the whole story. We knew that we will want in the long run some metadata, but our main stories regarding the context is for tracing actually. So that's why it's something implicit through the fiber, because we want to do that for tracing actually. But since people are more interested in metadata locally, we need to push that story ahead. I mean, two stories, for example, that 2 or 3 stories that should happen in the future, or that I want to happen in the future, is tracing, monitoring, and also configuration. And that there's nothing started yet on that realm, but the idea is to keep those things started after 1.0 probably.
Yeah, that was actually something I spoke with Paul about, who wrote the Lucky framework, is that Crystal and the library surrounding things like Datadog, it's one of the hindrances for me deploying an app to Crystal in production. I can do it in my personal projects and smaller projects, but if I were going to deploy a large scale project, having tracing built into Crystal, or at least integrations with big providers like Datadog, is something at least you should consider, because it's the monitoring story is just not as robust yet. Just needs a little bit of work. Mm-hmm. If you could ask the Crystal community for help on something, either in the compiler or in the community projects, what is something that you think we could use in the community, or that we could use community help for?
There is a lot of stories of designing things that will fit nicer in the language. It's not about creating the modules, but there's need to be a design around stuff. The logging module is an example. Like, it's not a lot of code, but we need to come and go with some ideas. Having those discussions is sometimes hard to convince people like this is the right approach. I will really like. I have had talk with Paul from Lucky Framework regarding how a configuration module could look like. So that could start happening, and if there is a nice solution, we can adopt it and maintain it and move it to the Crystal Lang organization, as it happened in the beginning with Shards. Shards at the beginning was a project independent from the organization, and then we adopted it and we dropped what we have done so far regarding dependencies. So that story can happen again. So So designing a nice configuration and starting to have the discussion about the different use cases, I think it will be valuable. The idea is to have one blessed way to do configuration. We have some stories I have shared with Paul. It's sometimes hard to share them publicly because there's a lot of opinions around and it's hard to know where you want to focus. But then the recent debugging requires some more contributions because I don't know, there's Python code that I'm not so familiar with. There are a lot of use cases that are not covered for sure, and there's not a lot of testing to be sure that we don't go backwards in the supported scenarios. So that's a way if you want to contribute to the compiler itself. On the shards, there's definitely configuration will be a great idea. Database access are always in lack of love because there are more data types that need to be supportive. MySQL changed the authenticated method and changed how the things are to be authenticated at the beginning of the sessions. So things are always starting to break with a matter of time, and they need constant maintenance. It's terrible. All the database driver write the protocol directly on the socket. And that's a story that if you want to just submit a query, that's simple, that's great. But to support all the possible types and all the possible authentication methods going through SSL or not, it's hard because you usually don't have those use cases when you're just doing Docker app and start the PostgreSQL and doing your database. You need to have more and more use case. So I think it would be great to have more experiences, more use case scenarios there on the database also and help for fixing the things that are broken. That would be great.
Well, if someone is looking for ideas on what to start on or help Crystal move forward, I think that's a really good list. I think we've covered a ton of things. I have to have you back on to dig more into some of this stuff, but I'm really glad that we were able to kind of walk through a lot of the different things you've been working on and a lot of the different ideas and concepts in Crystal. If people want to find you on the internet, where is the best place to find you?
I'm Cardiff in most of the places. I'm on Twitter, Cardiff. I'm on GitHub, Cardiff. So those are good place to find me. If you go to Mana's website, my email is there, but I think using GitHub in the prepared repository or Twitter is good enough for reaching me out. Yeah, definitely. Or in the Crystal forum, that's definitely another way. If you can private message me, I think, or write a post and mention, that works.
That's good. If anyone needs to get a hold of you, I'm sure they can probably find you now. This is Jack from Chicago Crystal, and we have a website, chicagocrystal.org, and you can email admin@chicagocrystal.org if you need to get a hold of me, or Chicago Crystal on Twitter. And I am 123 on the internet, which is WONTRUFREE. And thank you for joining us for an interview with Brian, and please stay up to date with us, and we'll be back. Thanks. Bye. A big thank you to our producer, Christy Flores, who edits these podcasts, and our DJ, Bill Wesley, who provides the tracks and samples for these episodes. This was an episode of Chicago Crystal, building community and getting stuff made in our favorite language. We'll see you soon.